QSO Today, episode 317, Marcel Stieber, AI6MS. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. Go to icomamerica.com/amateur for more information. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is still open in on-demand mode until September 9th. This means that all of the great content and speakers are still on the platform. Only the chat system is not operational. Marcel Stieber, AI6MS, is a relatively new ham relative to the number of years that the average interviewee at this podcast has. However, Marcel contributed 3 talks to the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo earlier this month on topics that included remote administration of amateur radio exams, wireless networks for emergency communications, and lithium-ion batteries and their care and feeding. He uses his amateur radio license and the opportunities it affords to advance the state-of-the-art, contribute to his community, and to share with all of us. AI6MS is my QSO Today. AI6MS, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Marcel?
For Z1UG, this is Alpha India 6, Mike Sierra. How do you copy?
You're 5x5 on Zoom, Marcel. Thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Absolutely. So I was licensed in 2008 while I was a student at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, formerly known California Polytechnic State University in California. It's about 3 hours south of San Francisco. The story goes I was heavily involved with the cycling club on my campus, and they volunteered for some of the local bike events. And when I signed up on their volunteer portal, they had an option to join the logistics team. So I clicked the logistics button, and then there was a subtopic to click communications. And I said, oh, that sounds fun. I'll check the box. So I checked the box to sign up as a communications logistics volunteer for the Wildflower Century. And a couple days later, I got an email saying, what's your call sign? We need your call sign to sign up for this. And I said, well, that's a little bit pretentious. Why do they need a call sign for me to be a volunteer for their event? And then sure enough, they write me a nice email back and say, well, actually, you need to be a licensed amateur radio operator. Here's some information. Actually, there's a test session going on the same day as this event if you'd like to get licensed in one of the nearby cities. So sure enough, I did. And my roommate and I at the time, KI6QDF, we took the bus down to Santa Maria where John Portune, W6NBC, ran a testing session, and we both got licensed on Cinco de Mayo 2008. So that's my licensing story, if you will, which ties into finding the antenna tower at my college campus, but that's a longer story, so we'll save that one for another time.
So did you have the license before the race then?
No, so it was the same day that of the race. Instead of actually volunteering for the race, at least that's how my memory serves me, we ended up going to do the license exam instead, and then volunteered for something else a couple days before the race for some prep.
And it's my understanding that you were an electronic engineering major at that point?
Yeah, so I was an electrical engineering major at Cal Poly. I had just switched majors, so I actually started as a mechanical engineer my freshman year, taking all the fun casting, welding, machining courses. And then I switched majors because I started getting more interested in radio. And that kind of all tied together with my getting a license story. I was walking down campus one day, and I could have sworn that the antenna tower that I suddenly appeared above the electrical engineering building, and I'd never seen it before, right? And it was one of those things where you just have to lift your head up and look into the sky, and then you see this massive HF tower that had, a tri-bander and a 40-meter dipole on it. And then I went over to the door, and the door of the shack was closed and locked, but it had a little sign that said, hey, every other Thursday, we've got a meeting at this time in this room. So for the next 3 weeks in a row, my roommate and I went to that room at that time. And none of those 3 weeks did they have someone there. So then we started some emails and phone calls, and then ended up figuring out that the club kind of didn't really exist at the time. And then that's when we restarted the club. So they had a couple people signing paperwork. So it's been continuously there, but there was not really a club to speak of back in 2008. I think that was 2007.
Well, isn't that a funny thing? It's like having an interest in VW bugs, for example, and then all of a sudden seeing every VW bug that passes you on the street that you never noticed before. The same thing with antennas. I think hams have this, we're tuned into antennas and we spot every single one, but most people will walk around and they'll never notice that there is even an antenna there.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that. I'm an outdoor trip leader with my university, so we were leading trips with students. And in the months after I got licensed, every single road trip we took, sometimes 6, 7, 8 hour drives through California to go to some rock climbing or hiking location, I would notice every single antenna in the hillside. I would notice all these microwave links. I would notice these HF towers from some random ham that we drove past. Much to the group's demise, because I'd be pointing them all out as we drove past, but slowly learning. And I absolutely agree. Yeah, you start spotting them everywhere, to the point where my wife is now identifying different antenna types. And hey, look, there's a folded dipole. And hey, look, isn't that a tri-bender? And
has she gotten her license?
She has. Yeah, she got licensed pretty early on before we got married. So that was a good sign.
What was your first call sign?
Kilo India 6, Quebec Delta Juliet. Quite a mouthful. That was my sequential call sign. So yes, a KI6, which was 2008 timeframe. And then I upgraded to my extra within the first couple of years. I think it was my third year of university. I got my extra during the summer. I did a summer internship in Southern California and took the summer to study, and then passed my extra exam down in Simi Valley. That was very interesting for me because as an electrical engineering student, I would say about 70% of the extra exam question pool comes almost directly from my curriculum as a junior electrical engineer, so my third year electrical engineering courses. So a lot of the like antenna theory wasn't there yet. That was my later classes. But all the other material, transistors and electronics, and a lot of that was very, very much straight from the courses, which made it a lot easier. And then I got my vanity shortly after.
So before we started recording, you pulled the drape aside and revealed your amateur radio shack and workbench. What's the current rig on the bench?
My home rig that I just use for repeater work is an FT 8800R from Yaesu. And the reason that I have that is because one of my good kind of ham friends / Elmers, KE6RKT, Bill Blodgett, he was at Cal Poly with me and was much more knowledgeable than the rest of us when we were kind of restarting the club. And he had that rig in his car, and he just was like, yep, it's a good rig. And then I bought one and been using it ever since.
Do you have a favorite operating mode?
I would say FM repeaters. So VHF and UHF is where I spend 99% probably of my ham time is using them. Honestly, I would say if I had a favorite operating mode, it would be climbing towers or working on repeater infrastructure, because I really enjoy that part of the hobby. But for actual operating and transmitting, I would say it's VHF and UHF.
When I was your age, that was my favorite thing too. Now when you get older, you actually are afraid to go on the roof for some reason. I don't know what happens. There's something in the brain, I think, that triggers that says, hey, this is really dangerous.
Gravity gets stronger, I hear, as you get older.
Yeah, well, no, I remember going up towers and not clipping on until I actually got out on the arm and got to the antenna and thinking, well, that was perfectly okay. And then I watch these climbers now that are clipping going all the way up, and I'm thinking, wow, was I stupid? Well, let me ask you a question. You know, for most of the amateur radio operators that I interview, they're older, they're old-timers who've been in ham radio for many years. For younger people, what do you think is the attraction?
That's a great question. For me, the attraction was really, it was a way to take my education and apply it, and I would say that amateur radio actually had a very strong influence on my education in college, in the sense that what I was learning, I mentioned earlier, the amateur extra exam is very similar to some of the electrical engineering materials. One of the moments that really stuck out for me was a second year course, so EE 255, which is an electromagnetics class, where you learn about coax, you learn about different, electromagnetic fields and waves and such. And it was that Sunday, I was at a local ham's house, one of my Elmers. and we were running coax through his attic. And when we terminated everything, he pulled out his little TDR, or time domain reflectometer, and he sat down and we used it to measure the coax and make sure that it was okay. We hadn't kinked anything anywhere, hooked up a short and open and load on the end of it and made sure it was all good, and then plugged it all in. So I had this practical experience on Sunday. That Monday morning, I don't know, it was 8 a.m. class or something. My then roommate as well, who was there that weekend with me, and I are sitting in our electromagnetics class, and the professor, who also happened to be a ham, was talking about time domain reflectometry that day in class. And it was literally less than 24 hours after we had practically used it. We both understand the piece of equipment. We knew how it worked. We knew the practical application of it. And then the next day we were learning the theory in class and could do all the math and understand the theory behind it, which was really amazing. And that still sticks to me today. That's one of the pieces of content in my courses that I fully understand and I'm really comfortable talking about, which is fascinating.
My interview with Mark Smith, KR6ZY, is up this week. Mark is also a Cal Poly San Luis Obispo graduate, and we spent some time on Cal Poly, so we don't have to go in deep. However, I did want to ask, how important was the Cal Poly experience to your ham radio career, and does it play a part now?
Yes to both parts of that question. So ham radio is part of my Cal Poly experience, twofold. So one, because the club wasn't really existing when I started there, it gave me a really good opportunity. There was a void for, hey, this needs some leadership, this needs some people to form a group, and we had access to an 80-foot HF tower, some really nice equipment, and a really strong amateur radio community in San Luis Obispo County. Mark was one of those, and several other Elmers in the area. So with that gave myself, my roommate, and a number of our close friends then built up a very strong club at the time. I think we peaked at 35 or 40 active members that were really going to everything. We were running quarterly test sessions. We were involved in all sorts of local events, and we did a lot of event support, bike rides, races, triathlons, adventure races, you name it. And that was a really important part of kind of tying in with the curriculum and creating this community for us. That was my fraternity of radio, if you will, that we had. Related to that, the department chair, the professor that became department chair during that time, Dennis Derrickson, AC0P, he was also a ham and was in RF and microwaves in his background, and was very supportive of the club throughout that time frame. So not only did he kind of support our endeavors and our strange asks to put antennas on the roof and that sort of thing, but he also helped found what we call the Freshman Licensing Initiative, which is something that I worked on. One of the key things, a brief aside, one of the challenges with starting a ham club on campus is that there was only one person in the county that was running test sessions regularly, really, and that was John Portune, who also spoke at the QSO conference. He was in South County, and as students without vehicles, if you're a freshman or sophomore or even junior or senior without a vehicle, there was not a very easy way to get to Santa Maria from San Luis Obispo. So you'd have to take like an hour and a half worth of buses on and off to get there, which is a relatively large barrier to entry for students. So one of the key things that we started was starting test sessions on campus regularly. So every quarter we had some of the local hams come in and run test sessions on campus so we could start licensing students. So all the students would always get licensed in waves, and we'd have all sequential call signs, which made for some fun stories. But one of the things that then Professor Derrickson recognized was that he wanted to expand that even more. Why wait until they're interested in radio? Let's feed them radio sooner and expose them to amateur radio earlier. So we put together this freshman licensing initiative where every freshman electrical engineering student, as part of their introductory lecture, the EE 111 class, would take the technician exam as their second midterm for the class. And that was very groundbreaking at the time. It was something that we got a lot of questions about, especially a lot of people that were questioning the value of ham crams and just getting people licensed, and people that were just getting licensed just so they have it and not using it. But it was very transformative. We were running like 110 person sessions in a 50-minute class period, just to give an idea of kind of the logistics behind it. So a lot of paperwork getting filled out in advance, and then like 6 hours of paperwork afterwards. But the thing that I always think is important to mention, I always say that every single person that has a license is one more person that can be an advocate for amateur radio. It's one more person in the world that knows what amateur radio is. It's one more person in the world that knows that there is a regulatory committee for it. They both the international and their national one. It's one more person that understands that there are rules, there are bands, there are modes, there are radios, there are antennas. And I think that's important and valuable no matter what, especially if you consider that these are the people that will get, in this case, electrical engineering degrees and going out into the world and designing the next, computers or the next transmission lines or the next, LED transformer that's going to cause HF noise because someone designed it poorly and didn't think about RMI or RFI or something. That's huge. So that's always my answer is I think it's really important that we encourage as many people to get licensed as possible. I'm still doing that today.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 MHz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for SOTA activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. How many hams do you think came from the freshman licensing initiative after that was started?
Before we managed to switch to some free VECs, it was optional to actually have the test count as a formal exam. Now we just do them all because it doesn't cost the students anything unless they opt out for privacy reasons. But we're getting over 100 a year from that because the class is normally 110 to 140 or so, somewhere in that range.
Well, that's pretty amazing, actually. And how many of those do you think become active?
So we have 2 interesting papers that we've written kind of on the topic of the Freshman Licensing Initiative and using amateur radio in education. They're on my QRZ, and we can link them in the notes as well. We've done some surveys both at the end of the freshman year and later in the course or the curriculum to see how many people actually use it actively. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but something along the lines of, more than 50% of them never end up using it for anything except in their courses, because we're starting to incorporate license spectrum as part of the educational curriculum, which is kind of cool. So when they take their 300 level wireless communications course or a digital communications class, they can actually transmit and experiment and use actual airwaves and not just ISM band and stuff, which is really cool. But outside of that, people that actually get involved with either the amateur radio club or use their license from something else, if 5% do, I'm happy. If 10 or 20% do, I'm thrilled. And I think that's fine. It's actually pretty neat. We've had a number of students come back after, they come back from their summer or their winter break then, because they would go home for Christmas. They would come back and they had told all their family members that they'd gotten licensed, and then found out that, oh, their grandfather was a ham, or this other family member was a ham, and then they would come back with a radio and then get more involved on campus. So it's kind of neat what opportunities it opened for the students, because they didn't even think to ask, family members or friends or something else for that.
Now, the way you're talking, it sounds to me like you still have an affiliation with Cal Poly?
I do. Yeah, so I'm my current affiliations with Cal Poly. I'm officially the industry advisor for the Cal Poly Amateur Radio Club, Whiskey 6 Bravo Hotel Zulu, or Big Hairy Zebra. And I'm also currently the industry advisory board chair for the electrical engineering department. So since last year, but yeah, so I'm still very involved at the campus. I think it's a very important place, and it's a very good university that cares about its students, and learn by doing is their big philosophy. So hands-on support is huge, and that still stands today.
Well, to my sorrow, I said this in the interview with Mark, that to my sorrow, I wanted to go to Cal Poly, but was already at UC Santa Barbara. They wouldn't let me move over, but I think I would have been an electronic engineer had I done that. Do you think that amateur radio should be a requirement then for the electronic engineering curriculum worldwide?
That's a good question. I think that mandating things is always difficult because it can often make it lose its appeal. I think in the case of amateur radio, at least in the United States, with the exam kind of being a way for the FCC to recognize that you know enough to you should know enough after taking that exam that you're careful when you start transmitting, kind of thing, so that you try not to cause problems on the air, right? And if that's like the barrier to entry there is just a little bit of education, then tying that education portion in to an existing curriculum where a good portion of that is very relevant to that curriculum and is definitely relevant to that profession, I would argue yes, actually, right? So I think it is actually a very good thing that can be incorporated. Just like you might do field trips for a class in high school and visit, I don't know, a nuclear power plant or something, right? Maybe not in high school. I did that in college, but you'd visit some local company or something. You'd spend a day visiting this local company, and most of the people are never going to get a job in that industry, unless the tomato canning industry or something, right? But the exposure to it and the education and the knowledge and awareness of that is worth it. So in that sense, yeah, I think amateur radio is a very relevant field trip, if you will, for electrical engineers, and is something that brings benefit to them, whether or not they realize it immediately or if they recognize it several years down the line when they're now the RF expert on some project at some company they're working at.
Has amateur radio been a help to you professionally?
Yes, I actually got my job through amateur radio. A funny story, at a career fair at Cal Poly, I had clipped my handheld radio to my belt, and was walking through. We usually encourage hams to do that when they're going to the career fair, and at least for sure put their call sign on their resume, but they have to know it, because that's how you always quiz them, is you say, hey, I see you have your amateur radio license, what's your call sign? And you have it in front of you on their resume, but they have to give it to you. That's my cheap trick from a recruiting perspective. But no, so I'm walking through this career fair, and I have my radio clip to my belt, and I hear someone shout out from a couple feet away, hey, is that an amateur radio? And I say, yeah, sure is, and I'm president of the amateur radio club, all cocky and everything. And then she turns around and says, oh yeah, well, I was president of the amateur radio club 9 years ago here. And that started a conversation that turned into a tour of the ham shack, that turned into an internship, that turned into a full-time job. Yeah, that was pretty cool.
From your perspective, what can we do as a community to bring more younger people to amateur radio?
That's a great question. I think the challenge in amateur radio is always one of, with any other community, is being a welcoming community, right? And recognizing that the hobby is very broad, it's very diverse. There are so many different aspects and facets of it. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths of amateur radio, but it's also one of the biggest weaknesses that we have. There are people that want to get into amateur radio purely to be able to carry an HT and be able to use the repeater for emergency communications and do ARIES or RACIES in their local community. There are amateur radio operators that purely want to do it so that they can build microwave and do point-to-point microwave from hilltops and just experiment. There are operators that get in purely for event support. That's how I got in, right? As I was doing a lot of event support. And I think with those various aspects, there's room for everyone, no question about it. until like the day where we lose all our spectrum. But for now, there's room for everyone. We just need to be nice to each other. We need to be open and willing to bring people in and acknowledge that there are new and different things coming every year, right? If I had started as a ham 30 years earlier, there would have been no such thing as APRS. There would have been no such thing as, FL Digi or FT8 or JT65, right? These are all new things and they're exciting and they're different ways of using the hobby. And sometimes it's just modes or bands, and sometimes it's totally different things, and totally different ways to use the technology that we wouldn't have thought of ourselves. And I think it's important to accept those, to foster those, and to encourage those. So if there's one thing, it's put a smile on our faces, say our pleases and thank yous, and be excited when there's a new ham on the air and happily talk them to it. I have my own little story there. The very, very first time I transmitted on the radio, I remember it very clearly. It was on the patio of the dorm room, Sierra Madre in San Luis Obispo at Cal Poly. And I had just fixed the keypad for an ICOM 4SAT, a little handheld UHF radio. We managed to get a battery charged up enough, and then we're standing out in this courtyard. And then I had been watching the videos and like looked online, and they say, okay, then you do this thing, and then so I key up the radio and I say, CQ, 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 this is KI6QDJ, over, right? And let go. And on a repeater, right? And everyone's going, oh, silly, silly Marcel. But sure enough, yeah, one person came back, W6FM, and he says, hello, it sounds like you're a new ham, welcome. And normally we don't say CQ on repeaters, but I'm glad you're here and let's talk. And he's a great friend of mine still to this day. But that first contact, that very first response of someone being friendly, being educational in just the right way, and being supportive, that's what makes you stick with the hobby. And I'm still here many years later, many licenses later, and I think that's just really what we should learn from it.
That's a good lesson. I am a frequent listener to the wind system in California from here. I often hear you can tell if it's a KN6 now, asking for a signal report. That's kind of a way to say, I'd really like to talk to somebody. I'd like to see if this works. I remember my first, must have been 1974, when I got on the air for the first time, and I was on the Palisades repeater in Los Angeles using a friend's radio, and I asked for a signal report. And the guy comes back to me and he says, you're full quieting. I said, thank you. And I sat there and I said, well, what does that mean?
Yep.
What does that mean? It would have been helpful at that time, perhaps, if somebody came back to me and said, that means that you're really strong, that you have a nice signal. It sounds to me like you're a new ham. So, yeah, I think that's exactly the way to handle it. You gave a talk at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo about fully remote amateur exam administration. This is kind of a new thing, that hams are now being licensed remotely during the pandemic. What is Exam Tools software, and how does it work?
Yeah, so Exam Tools software is a piece of software developed by Richard Bateman, KD7BBC, and he developed this software. I don't know all the history on it, but kind of mid-2000s, and has been using it for a number of years for in-person exams. So it was a way to do computer-based testing for amateur radio. And computer-based testing is pretty much, instead of having all that paperwork and the answer keys and all the pieces of paper and all this stuff digitally, in paper physically, you would now have it digitally. So you could have candidates on laptops, you could have them on tablets, in the room taking their exams while you're watching them, using exam tools. They also had a thing called GradeCam, where you could use your cell phone or a webcam on your laptop and hold the grading sheet up to the camera with all the bubbles on it, and it would instant grade it. The candidate would have put their candidate PIN number in there as well, and it would automatically fill out their 605 or like their forms and show it all be ready to go, which is pretty impressive. So that was the original version of Exam Tools, and then starting March this year, we put together a working group, because in the United States in March of 2020, COVID kind of hit and everyone went on lockdown, and most in-person exam sessions around the country were completely canceled. So the number of licenses dropped, I think, by like 90% from the previous year for the same time frame. And we had a working group that sat down and scrambled and said, how can we still offer licenses with this in place, and what can we do? And Exam Tools was a great way. It was an existing piece of software that worked well enough that we could kind of do some proof of concept. And then we came out with a tier 2 version. Well, I should say Richard came out with. We helped him develop it, but he did all the work on it, hundreds and hundreds of hours of coding over 2 months, and released a new and improved tier 2 software that's been used by over 3,000 licenses, several hundred VEs, and 3 VECs that are currently using it actively. So that's pretty cool that we could be a part of that, and just enable, kind of like we talked about earlier, different facets of amateur radio. This is a different facet of licensing, just to enable teams to continue providing licenses and getting new people on the air.
Are you able to also license amateurs or prospective amateurs who are outside of the United States to get their licenses if they have an American mail address?
Yes, actually. Very similar. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with Anchorage Amateur Radio Club, VEC. They're based in Alaska. They've been doing proctored remote exams since like 2014, when the FCC updated Part 97 to allow that in the U.S. And they actually have a focus on overseas vets sometimes, or overseas service women and men, to get them licensed when they're not in the U.S. And that's always been allowed by the FCC as well. The only limitations there are privacy rules in different countries. So like GDPR, for example, we need to make sure that we're properly handling that, and that they meet the FCC requirements of having a valid an FRN and having a valid mailing address in the U.S. So if they meet that criteria, then it's at the discretion of the exam team to handle that. But yeah, it's actually been kind of fun. We've licensed. I was on a couple exams for people overseas recently on some of our fully remote exams, including some servicemen. At 3 a.m. they're logging in from their barracks in Germany and trying to take the exam. So that's pretty cool.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
So what are you doing in terms of ensuring that there's no cheating going on? If somebody's just using their laptop computer, they could have the book open next to it. What is it that you're doing in order to ensure that everything's on the up and up?
A little bit of tools and a lot of procedures is kind of the short answer. So the tools are video conferencing. So we're using, most teams are using Zoom. Some choose to use other software. Pros and cons, of course. But yeah, kind of it's just what a lot of people have and are comfortable with. And the tools are that, and then the actual process of giving the exam is really where it comes down to. So as part of giving the exam, there's a whole pre-check sequence and a getting ready for the exam that takes more time than the exam usually, which is, doing a room sweep of the camera. If they just have a laptop with a camera in it, sometimes we'll ask them to take a cell phone out with another camera and set it off to the side of the room so you get a third angle. If they have a USB webcam, then they can put it into a different angle. They would show us the room. We would clear off the desk area. We'd make sure they only have one monitor, that there are no distractions. We always joke about it inside the VE community for fully remote exams, but like a restroom is actually one of the best spots to take an exam because it's usually pretty easy to declutter. You can lock the door and there's usually nothing on the walls. So you can do a room sweep, and sometimes there are mirrors as well that help us see different angles and make sure there's not any concern. But yeah, the main thing is, so stage one is making sure the environment is good. And we've not given exams if the environment wasn't good, if the internet connection wasn't good. That's where Anchorage's method is actually very good. They're designed for very poor internet connections because they're designed for people on like satellite connections in Antarctica, for example, or in very rural parts of Alaska where they have, tens or hundreds of kilobit connections. Our system does not work for those environments, and we send people over to Anchorage and say, hey, sorry, try a different method. We can't guarantee the exam with this. And we've invalidated exams if the connection drops or if we can't hear their audio or if their video is not good. So all of this is kind of prep work. During the actual exam itself, we do some prep on the computer. We make sure the programs are all closed. they're sharing their screen with us, and we're seeing their video the whole time. So we normally have a video directly facing them, so you can see their eyes and you can track their eye movement. So you have 3 volunteer examiners at least, usually a 4th in case one of the VE's internet drops, and then have them watch the candidate during the exam. So you can see every line that they're reading with their eyes. You can see if they look off screen. You can see if they pull something else up on their monitor, and that's been very good. The feedback we've gotten from VEs running these sessions and VECs actually is they feel that the exam integrity is actually higher on these exams than some in-person sessions, because in the in-person sessions you might have a room of 20 or 30 or 40 people, or in my case for the freshman licensing initiative we'd have 100 people in a room, and technically you only need 3 volunteer examiners watching that whole room, but there's no way that you can't make sure that someone's not slipping a piece of paper out of their pocket or has answers written on their hand or something. So that gives us pretty good confidence, and the ability to invalidate an exam or redo an exam if anything's wrong, or pause an exam and ask questions or have them move a camera. Hey, what was that noise? Hey, we just saw something over there. Can you point your camera over there? What's going on there? And you can tell if someone's lying, and we've invalidated exams when there have been concerns, and say, hey, sorry, come back to a different session in person sometime, and that works fine.
You mentioned APRS a few minutes ago. Why would anybody want to get started with APRS these days, with smartphones and applications and broadband digital networks?
Well, same question, Eric. Why would anyone want to get started with amateur radio these days with the internet and video conferencing and cell phones, right?
It's a good question. So what's your answer for APRS? Because, for those of us that think of APRS, we're thinking of old packet radio, 9600 baud. What is the application for APRS these days?
So I would say most people, I don't use APRS that much myself these days. I used it pretty heavily when I was in college, and that's where I kind of got really into it, using it for vehicle tracking at events. So we were using it at the Wildflower Triathlon. We'd have, 3 dozen trackers and 5 digipeaters on the hill that were all on our own network, our own frequency, and getting, 90-second location updates for every single vehicle in the field with very little cell phone coverage on those courses. And we didn't even have VHF voice coverage throughout the whole course, but we would have, locations for everything. So, hey, someone radios in, biker down at mile 35. Oh, well, ambulance 14 is at mile 27. Perfect. Hey, ambulance 14, go over to mile 35. You're the closest, and go respond to that. So that's one from location tracking that I really got excited about and used it a lot with. These days, I primarily turn it on if I want to make myself a nice, have an easy way to share my location with a bunch of my friends if I'm going on a trip, or digipeaters for, using them for weather stations or other stuff like that. I think just like many other parts of amateur radio, it's a platform that you can experiment with, and there's a lot of existing infrastructure that you can interact with. And both of those make it a very appealing thing in my mind for, hey, there are all these digipeaters that you can go talk to. You can send them a signal and they'll talk back to you. It's fun, just like a digipeater on the ISS or something flying overhead.
Now, does an APRS node, does it also act as a relay, so that if you're working the course and you've got vehicles on the course that are running APRS, if one of those vehicles doesn't have line of sight to the digipeater, does it digipete through other vehicles?
It could. We generally didn't have ours configured that way. The peak at that event, like I said, we had 5 digipeaters, so we actually covered most of the course. The biggest challenge is when multiple digipeaters hear a signal that you deal with your back end, so your backhaul effectively back to your net control site. That was one of the more challenging things. We actually experimented with alternate frequencies. We had some running over wireless internet, actually, so we'd have like a point-to-point link between one of the digipeaters and net control just to reduce the airtime and improve the amount of signals we can get in.
You did your master's thesis on radio direction finding network receiver design for low-cost public service applications. That was actually the title. Can I ask, are we close to being able to put up remote direction finding receivers in large metropolitan areas to pinpoint jammers and other interference?
Yes. We're past it, I would say. The capability has been there for years. The biggest challenge has always been kind of system level integration and getting it put together in a way that's usable, practical, maintainable, and accessible, if you will, if we use a whole bunch of descriptors. There are groups of amateur radio operators. There was one in the East Coast that put up, a number of Doppler direction finding units on hilltops, and then was using it to locate jammers in town, and that was very successful. The challenge is always, you know how difficult it is for a ham club to sponsor one repeater site and get one repeater on the air and maintain that repeater and keep it on the air and keep it running and keep it operational. Now multiply that by the number of receive stations you need to set up for a direction finding network, and that's your infrastructure overhead, right? So there is a decent amount of infrastructure overhead depending on what kind of system you're using. But that's why, like cell phone companies, they have a whole bunch of infrastructure overhead, and they do effectively direction finding for many different applications in many different ways. Sometimes just by which antenna or which cell you're going into. And then things like the Malaysia flight as well, bouncing signals off of satellites and counting time of arrival and which antenna it came off of to know where that would be and where that would put something. Those techniques exist, and they've existed for years. It's always a matter of application and implementation that's the challenge. So if I put out one challenge, if there's a group that has the resources and the people and the desire to actually put together a system, and wants to spend a year on it and wants to have some software developers write some back-end code to do some of the processing and then a web front end to actually put it onto something, and then some hardware folks that want to sit down and put together a direction finding network and make it scalable, I'd love to talk, right? APRS actually has some of those features built in, so you could build it on top of APRS if you wanted to. But I've had a number of these conversations over the years with, dozens of different groups emailing me being like, yes, we'd love to do this. Great. Here, let's talk. We'll give you started. And then you never hear back from them. And that's just, I think, the nature of the beast.
They realize that the elephant is pretty big.
Yep.
If you're eating that elephant one bite at a time, do you do that with software-defined radios? Do you think that you could get enough selectivity on a hilltop with a software-defined radio that you'd be able to actually do that kind of detection?
Yeah, so radio direction finding is a fascinating field, a whole bunch of different detection types and what you're doing. There's Doppler, there's time of arrival, there's time difference of arrival, there's angle of arrival. There are all sorts of different methodologies of understanding where or how a signal got to you. The software-defined radios are very useful because they interface nicely with digital computers and they kind of digitize the baseband. And that can allow you to do a lot more advanced things in the software space and not rely as much on the hardware. The example there being like a Doppler direction finding array uses a bunch of antennas and some diodes and some electronic switching gear to get an audio tone at audio frequency that corresponds to the direction of the signal, right? So you're effectively down converting the signal to audio band, right? But you're losing a lot of information in that transformation process. Now, if you do that same thing at baseband levels and you're digitizing a signal with an SDR of some form, you can do a whole bunch more processing at an FPGA level or at a software level to get more information out of that. You could do radio fingerprinting IDing. You can get, multipath distortion removal. That sort of stuff can all be done. You have the software world at your disposal, but it takes more processing and more time and development to do something like that. So yes, the second half of that would be where you deploy these is very critical. Like taking advantage of existing mountaintop infrastructure is very tempting, but it's also very challenging from an RF environment perspective. On our Zoom call, I've got a picture of Loma Prieta, which is one of the large mountaintops in near Silicon Valley in California, and it has a dozen towers and multiple high-power transmitting stations at it. And putting a software-defined radio at that site without a whole bunch of filtering would not be a good idea, and would not be very effective. So that's where small solar-powered things like the wildland fire operators, they put out their little repeaters out on a mountaintop with some batteries and a solar panel and let it run. That sort of setup can actually be very efficient and very effective for a direction finding network, for example.
You have some de-expedition experience under your belt. Can you talk a little bit about your de-expeditions and where you went and what you did there?
Sure. De-expedition is that's giving me a little bit more credit than I think that's worth. When I, as part of university or after university, and as one of my internships kind of during university, I went to Ghana in West Africa, and spent a summer there, and then I spent 5 months there after I graduated, working with a nonprofit organization called Medicine on the Move that used light aviation for rural health education. That was my kind of buzzword. So they built aircraft, tube and cloth aircraft in Ghana in West Africa with local engineers and students, and trained them to be pilots and had them flying to places that were not very accessible to teach people to wash their hands, not defecate in the water that they drank from, and very basic hygiene things that saves a lot of lives, educating what germs are and that sort of thing. Very, very cool, very engineering focused. And as part of my time there, I had, of course, become very active in amateur radio from my first trip there to my longer stay there. And I went through the quite lengthy process of trying to get a call sign and a license there, bringing my FT857D with me, and then they had a Avtech Academy, which was a aviation technology academy for students in attending there, and we kind of did some classes on radio, and then did some de-expedition work, if you will. So we got on the air and made a handful of contacts and with the students in the class, and just had a good time with radio and using it for education again. So it's kind of funny how that all goes full circle.
Did you become a pilot?
I did not. My dad's been a pilot since before I can remember anything. And I've always enjoyed flying in planes and enjoyed being in planes. I've done some lessons here and there, but I've never felt the desire to actually become licensed as a private pilot. So it's a lot of time and effort and resources. And I currently like spending that time, effort, and resources on radio stuff. So,
well, no, I thought perhaps that when you were in Ghana, that perhaps you had the opportunity to fly in the tube and muslin airplanes.
Yes, I had many opportunities to fly in those aircraft, which was really fun. We did some aerial photography work that I helped with. I brought my DSLR with me, and we did some communications work, some survey work. I'd often fly second right-hand seat and just help out, and yeah, you get a little stick time as well. But never as the pilot. That was not something that I felt was high on my priorities list. But I definitely love flying and absolutely enjoy those aircraft. They are, we usually fly without the doors, just because it's very warm and you don't really need the doors because it's nice in the fresh air. But it's a very cool experience to fly in one of those aircraft at low altitudes through, very rural areas, with some good fun times and a lot of learning on both sides, both for us and the students and the pilots we were training, and the villages and communities that we visited. Very definitely life-changing, and on both sides, and that's always fun.
What do you think the greatest challenge is in terms of, from your perspective, to amateur radio now?
I think the greatest challenge to amateur radio now is kind of similar to what we, multifaceted. So we'll start with one, which is what we talked about earlier, around recognizing how multifaceted it is and that there's room for everyone, right? So I think that's part one. One of the things that, I hear stories regularly from new hams getting on the air, getting scolded for something or the other, people just not being friendly. Like, that's why we have, various online communities for people to anonymously yell at each other. They can do that there. I really prefer if amateur radio doesn't do that. So if we can all do our best to keep the airwaves clean and friendly and open and welcoming, I think that's step one. That's a really, really critical part of keeping the community accessible to everyone, welcome to everyone, and to continue growing it. We're never going to attract youth. We're never going to attract diversity. We're never going to attract more people to the hobby if we don't welcome them all equally. So I would say that's number one. Number two is adaptation and change over time, right? The hobby, historically, amateur radio is on the kind of bleeding edge of experimenting, of creating new modes, about discovering these higher frequencies, this VHF and UHF frequencies, and no one wants to use those. Why would we want to use those, right? And I think similarly, one of the areas that we need to continue to innovate in is finding more uses and more ways to use the hobby. and embracing those and trying them out and experimenting in those spaces. That can be anything from new digital modes that people are using, like Joe Taylor's modes that are work below the noise floor, which is still something that my brain, like, I understand it theoretically, but practically it just seems odd that you can pick something out of literally the noise, right? That one was always amazing, right? Other things like the NPR 70 modems. This is a new packet radio system invented by Guillaume in France, and it's a new packet radio, and it's something different. It's not a lot of people are using it yet. We've been, I just bought a couple nodes and have started playing with it myself, and it's just something different, right? It's much faster than 1200 baud packet. It's much slower than the 5.8 gigahertz point-to-point systems that I play with, but it's new and it's different, and it's trying out new modulations, new methodologies, new protocols, and I think that's important. So keep experimenting, keep trying new things, and keep welcoming everyone to the hobby.
Do you have a 30-second elevator pitch that you give to people when they say, "Oh, you do amateur radio"? That people still do that?
Yeah, and it kind of depends on the situation for what that pitch is, right? If it's a very technical community, the answer is usually, yeah, I have a license from the FCC that gives me access to a whole bunch of spectrum and authorizes me to build my own transmitters and antennas and use them to do whatever I want, talk to people, locate things, track things, whatever, right? That would be the more technical one. And I think that one of my professors utilized it like spectrum is a natural resource, just like our natural parks and other things. And this license gives you access to that spectrum, just like getting a national parks pass in the U.S. allows you into all these national parks. This license allows you into all this spectrum, and it's a lot of spectrum. It's pretty exciting. I still haven't worked every band or mode that's possible for amateur radio. I don't think I ever will. I don't think many of us ever will. But that's kind of the technical side, and I think that's always a really fun one. For people that have no idea what it is, they usually just recognize it from some movie where someone was talking on an HF rig in a quiet room calling for some scratchy, far-off distant place. That's kind of the every person knows amateur radio as this kind of thing. And to them, I usually give more of the other side, the event support side of, hey, did you know that all these, like the Boston Marathon, for example, that communications infrastructure is run by a couple hundred hams that do this on the back end, right? And they do all this stuff with all this technology, and they support that. They were there when the bombings happened at the finish line, responding to those incidents in real time. They're part of your local emergency communications groups. They're part of the community, and they're just a different set of volunteers, just like other people that want to go volunteer in a food bank. Right. So I think it's neat just to share the different aspects of it, like we talked about earlier.
What's the single most valuable piece of equipment on your workbench?
That sounds like a loaded question.
Well, it kind of is. I mean, if your wife said, Marcel, you have a beautiful workbench, but I'm afraid you're just going to have to get rid of everything, but you can keep one or two pieces. What are the one or two pieces that you would keep?
Probably my service monitor.
What kind of service monitor do you have?
I have an HP 8920B, and then I've got a portable one that my friends usually are the ones to borrow most of the time, that I bring to presentations or bring to mountaintops. So you keep the one nice one in the bench, you get it calibrated once, and you leave it there, and you don't touch it. And that was one that I use for radio tuning, all that sort of stuff. Ironically, it hasn't actually seen as much use recently. So the piece of equipment that I'm actually looking at that I use the most, I'm actually very happy with, is my DC power supply. It's an HP 6023A. A 20 volt 30 amp power supply that's just nice. It's a very nice bench grade power supply. It's very loud. The fan in it is a ridiculous 120 volt AC fan, but it's a very nice power supply that's great for just doing battery work, for doing radio work. Charging up batteries I can do very comfortably on that because I can set all the parameters and lock them in. And one twist of a knob doesn't suddenly blow up your lithium ion bank, so that's a good thing. I think my service monitor is probably the one that I would keep if I had to run out of the house and grab one piece of test equipment.
Yeah, that's what I would too. I have an 8921, so that would be the first thing that I would grab, and the photos of the kids, right?
Yeah. The two pieces of equipment that I use the most are my antenna analyzers, and that's one that I would say, I have an AI600, and then I have an Enritsu unit as well, and a little HF unit. But the A600 is really comes with me everywhere, because most of the time I'm going to someone else's house and helping them debug something on their antenna system, and that is 90% of the time you can solve that with a dummy load, a watt meter, an antenna analyzer, and you can pretty much solve their problems with that. You can figure out, is it a coax problem, is it an antenna problem, is it a radio problem, isolate the problem, and then help them solve it. So from a practical, like I'm leaving my shop to go to, or leaving my workbench to go to another ham's house, what am I bringing with me? It's my antenna analyzer, my bird watt meter, and my dummy load, size dependent on what radio they have. So anywhere from 5 watt to 250 watt. So
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
find something that you like to do and do it. Just do it. This theme's come up many times. Amateur radio is a very, very wide hobby with so many different facets and so many different aspects of it that relate to so many different things too. Like my current hobby in amateur radio is building battery packs and portable battery systems and telling people about it, right? That's my current amateur radio related thing that I'm doing. It's not radio, ironically. I mean, there's a Bluetooth radio in one of my battery management systems that talks to my cell phone, but that's not amateur radio. But it's definitely related to it, and it's related to the portable aspects of it, to the powering of it, right? And I'm getting a lot of fun with that. It's really relevant to what I do at work, and I'm learning a ton on both sides. That's been really great. And that hobby can change, right? And recognize that, you'll find something that you're interested in, find the community that helps support you in that. There's definitely a community for every aspect of amateur radio. It's been really neat with kind of this remote world of amateur radio. I mean, it's always a communication sport, right? It's in theory, but there's a large social aspect of that, of being in person with each other and going to club meetings, or doing event support together and doing the same event every year and seeing the same people at that event. That's a big aspect of it. And what's been really neat in the last 5 or so months, the amateur radio operators that I'm interacting with the closest, I have never met in person. So with the fully remote exams, for example, I'm working with VEs weekly and daily that I've never met in person. We've met many times virtually, in chat rooms, on video chats, in exam sessions, in brainstorming sessions, you name it. But there's a community, right? So I got involved in the last 5 months in fully remote exams, and there's a community that supports each other, that works through the problems together, that tries to solve things together, and it may not be where you expect it to be. So find the thing that excites you and have at it.
I think that ham radio is this amazing circus tent with a lot of sideshows.
Just to build on that real quick, Eric, the sideshows, each of those sideshows has performers, it has an audience, it has the builders that built that, and together they make that sideshow, right? So even just that facet of that sideshow, there are all the different people involved with that, right? Some people like to build repeaters, some people like to use repeaters, some people like to listen to repeaters, scanners. And I think it's such a broad hobby and such an amazing thing that it's just really, really fun.
Marcel, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's really a gas, so thank you so much for joining me in 73.
Absolutely, Eric. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and thank you so much for all your work on the Virtual Ham Expo. That was really an amazing experience for everyone, and a great example of take something that you're having fun with and make a difference in amateur radios.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Marcel. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AI6MS in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.